Abbas Amanat is a professor of history and international area studies here at Yale University, a specialist in Islamic history and Iranian history, and has been chair of the Middle East Studies Council here at Yale University. Michele Cumming has worked for 15 years directing a public health program in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania in North Africa, and has worked particularly in the area of maternal and child health. And since you're wondering, yes, she's my wife. Professor Frank Griffel teaches Islamic studies in our own religious studies department here at Yale University, and is a specialist in Islamic theology and also in contemporary Islamic trends, and is currently doing work that's generating quite a lot of excitement on the medieval Muslim theologian Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And Imam Yahya Hendi is the Muslim chaplain at Georgetown University, and that doesn't even begin to describe all of the things that this man does all over the world, speaking in Muslim countries and in the U.S., in mosques, churches, and synagogues about relationships among Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We're very honored to have the four of you, and we're going to mix up the order a little bit here. We're going to ask Professor Griffel to go first, Michele Cumming to go second, Imam Hendi to go third, and Professor Amanat to go fourth. So, please.
Well, thanks to Joseph Cumming, the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and the Yale Divinity School for hosting this event, and also thanks to Professor Muhammad Qasim Zaman for giving a very illuminating paper. All of us who were here yesterday evening witnessed a passionate debate about the terms of a liberal society in the West and its probable or improbable clashes with the claims of religion. Now, I was following that debate with great interest and, I have to say, a certain amount of envy, since I do not believe that there will be even nearly as much disagreement between the main speaker and the member of this panel. There's a second reason why it would not be that passionate. Yesterday, most of the panelists, as well as the main speaker, referred to the fact that their concerns were raised as Christians. Now, I, for once, do not claim to speak as a Muslim. In fact, I am an outsider to Islam, and like others on this panel, I have been invited in my capacity as a scholar on Islam rather than a scholar of Islam. Yet despite the fact that a certain lack of passion might prevent this panel from reaching the peaks of eloquence we could enjoy yesterday, let me point to the fact that distance might also have, at times at least, its benefits. None of us on this panel is actively engaged in the creation of what might be called a Muslim polity. Yet all of us are close observers of such attempts, and I, for once, can say that I am as curious for the outcome of Islam's engagement with democracy as many of our listeners in this room who might actually expect us to say what this outcome will be. Professor Qasim Zaman's presentation presented to us a selection of Islamic thinkers who might be regarded as positive intellectual forces in the creation of an Islamic democracy. Now let me cut right to the chase. Do I believe that all these thinkers are Democrats? No. Do I believe that they need to be in order to create a truly democratic society? Neither. I will explain these 2 points one by one. Let me voice my objection to Professor Zaman's paper, if there is any, by discussing the weakest link in the chain that he presented, and that is Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Now, picking the weakest spot might sound slightly unfair, but al-Qaradawi is also the most important link, so to speak, since he is the only representative from the Arabic nations of the Middle East, the region that most of the discussions about Islam and democracy focus upon. Already Professor Zaman indicated in his paper that according to al-Qaradawi's publications on Sharia and its relationship to democracy, al-Qaradawi will not tolerate a woman as a head of state, nor even the possibility of women gaining a majority position in the parliament. A close reading of al-Qaradawi's writings leads to an even more fundamental doubt about his democratic credentials. In his book on the jurisprudence of the state in Islam, the book that Professor Zaman quotes, Min Fiqh al-Dawla fil Islam, published in 1997, al-Qaradawi argues that democracy should be regarded as a distinctly Islamic form of government since it leads to the maximization of benefit, maslahah, for all Muslims, and creating such benefits is the initial intent of God when He reveals the Sharia. Let's not go into the question of whether this distinctly non-textual argument will really be successful in a Muslim discourse. I actually believe it might. But let's take a look at the small print, so to speak. Al-Qaradawi also says that the democracy he envisions is affected by certain limitations that are set by what he calls the qat'iyat al-shar'. These are, the qat'iyat al-shar' are the definite and unequivocal judgments of revelation or as they are derived by Sharia. Al-Qaradawi leaves open what is meant by this. Yet the critical observer fears that these unequivocal judgments of revelation might concern the right of freely choosing one's religion, maybe by even breaking away from Islam, the equal right of non-Muslim minorities, or the rights of equal participation of women, for instance. Now let me come to my second point. Should we expect or even require al-Qaradawi to be a true Democrat? In the late 1990s, a collection of papers on the Middle East was published under the provocative title, Democracies Without Democrats. Given the fact that there are no real Democrats in the Middle East, in a number significant to come even close to 50%, one might say, how should we expect the creation of democracy? I will try to give a brief answer to the question, which at the end of the day is positive. The first part of this answer is to point out that secularism is the result of a political process in the West and has, when Westerners expect it, in other societies, non-Western societies, very different connotations. Western secularism is the reaction to the close bond between state and clerical institutions in pre-1800 Europe. Let's not forget that during the French Revolution, the Tiers État, the third estate, rebelled against both the first and the second estate, that is, nobility and clergy, on account of their century-old cooperation. In Islam, the clergy, or the religious scholars, the ulama, that we mean by this, never had a position that comes even remotely close to the state power it shared in pre-1800 Europe. Therefore, in Islam, we have never seen such a violent reaction against the clergy and its power as we have seen in Europe or in the West during the Enlightenment or the processes of secularization during the 18th and the 19th century. In fact, by the mid-20th century, the Islamic ulama had lost almost all their authority. Just a quick anecdote to illustrate this point. During the 1950s, the Egyptian radio network, run by the semi-socialist government, prepared a radio program on the subject of abortion. The producers invited an Islamic scholar from Al-Azhar, which is the major Islamic seminary in Cairo, in order to present the Islamic position on abortion. When he came into the studio and they discussed the program with him, the scholar asked the producer, who was a state official and a representative of the state in this case, what exactly he wanted. Do you want Islam to forbid abortion, or do you want Islam to allow it? Now, well, those were the 1950s, and the situation by now is very different. Since the 1950s, we have seen a significant rise of the self-consciousness of the Muslim scholars. Still, what I argue for is that in contemporary Muslim polities, the scholars, the clergies, if you will, are just one group of political actors among others, among many, that have to defend their political ideals and their political goals on the marketplace of what might be called the Muslim civil society. The fact that people like Al-Qaradawi were the head of a religious authority, as well as that of a politician, should not disturb us too much. Unlike in the West, the clergyman does not carry the ballast of history on his shoulders. In fact, we have seen in the past 30 years the steady rise of the Muslim scholar as a politician. Let me finish by pointing out that democracies are most often created not out of a positive aspiration towards democratic ideals, but out of what might be called a negative realization, namely the sincere understanding that all other non-democratic ways of government do not serve the interest of the political actors who choose democracy. Yusuf al-Qaradawi's justification of democracy as an Islamic way of government seems to be born exactly out of that kind of motivation. Once the democratic polity he subscribes to is created, its survival is not guaranteed by al-Qaradawi's democratic or non-truly democratic credentials. In fact, the survival of democracies is never guaranteed by the democratic character of its leaders, but solely by the checks and balances of the whole democratic system. These checks and balances are controlled by the competing political actors. What I mean to say is that we Westerners should not expect the Islamic scholars to be any more or less democratic than other political actors in the Middle East. We find among Islam scholars those that are committed to democratic ideals and those that are not. Yet if we see the creation of lasting democracies in Muslim societies, it is not because Islam is particularly democratic. I don't know whether any religion is particularly democratic. If we see the creation of democracies, it is because the political actors in these societies, including those that speak in the name of Islam, agree upon such democracies because they realize that all other ways of government will fail their long-term interests. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to repeat the thanks that Frank offered to everyone who made it possible for this important conference to take place, and thank you for thanks to all of you who came to participate. And I am here from a different perspective. It's kind of an interdisciplinary panel, so my remarks will be a little bit different. I've used Professor Zaman's talk and paper as a springboard, so just take that in mind as you follow my reflections. As I read Professor Zaman's paper, several recurring questions came to my mind. In my response, I will share some of these questions and some of my reflections on these questions based on my experience of living and working in public health for 15 years in an Islamic republic with Sharia law in force. I will also draw from the experiences of my Muslim friends living in America. As a Christian, I have lived as a minority in an Islamic republic during a time when it began to aspire to democratization. My Muslim friends in America live as a minority in a society that sees itself as the world's leading democracy and in which a majority of the citizens profess some kind of Christian faith. It will be my aim in my reflections to practice the principle Jesus teaches us of removing the log from my own American and Christian eye before I attempt to remove any specks from any non-American or Muslim eyes. As some authors have pointed out, there is a common tendency in all religions for people to compare the best ideals of their own faith with the worst practices of another faith. When this approach is taken, inevitably the other is found wanting. Though I aspire to be fair in any comparisons that may come through in my reflections, I am as fallible and prejudiced as the next person, and certainly vulnerable to this same tendency as well. One of my first overarching questions in reading Professor Zaman's paper was this: in our discussions of theocracy and democracy in Islam and Christianity, how seriously are we taking into consideration the gap or disconnect between the ideals of religious belief and democracy and the practice of either of these by fallible human beings? Let me also point out that theories for the implementation of religious and democratic ideals are often predominantly devised by men, therefore often have, in practice, unforeseen consequences for women, no matter how well-intentioned the men may be. Women often want to ask how theories and ideas will affect their daily lives and the lives of their families. I was glad to see that Professor Zaman raised the issue of equality between men and women and among members of different faiths. Before I share some illustrations that may shed some light on my reflections, let me ask another question in the spirit of removing logs. Are Western societies, as experienced by Muslims, truly liberal democracies by the standards to which Western societies aspire, or even to the relatively liberal degree O'Donovan acknowledged as he was pointing out their illiberalism? Professor O'Donovan insightfully pointed out the subtle ways in which liberal democracy restricts the right of believers to assert universal visions. But my concern is whether so-called liberal democracies in the West, in practice, restrict the rights and equality of religious believers in much more blatant and mundane ways. In reflecting on Zaman's paper, I was reminded of the sadness I felt when a veiled Muslim friend of mine living here in America told me of the experience she and her family had just after the tragedy of September 11th. This family just happened to have packed up all their belongings on September 10th to move to another city. After driving several hours to make the move and arriving at the end of the day on September 11th at the apartment which was to be their new home, they were turned away by the landlady when she saw that they were devout Muslims. They were put out on the street with their small children and nowhere to spend the night. In the end, they found a place to sleep in the local mosque. Not long after that, she and her family were almost run down intentionally by a car in a supermarket parking lot. What does this experience and thousands of other experiences like it convey to Muslims living in America and abroad about the nature of democracy and liberalism here, and about the supposed Christian principles on which those are founded? If a discussion about theocracy and democracy involves a discussion about the balance between the common good and personal interests, who defines what the common good is? It seems that in too many cases, minorities and women's personal interests suffer for the sake of the so-called common good, which was, in fact, simply the good of those defining the common good. In America in the 18th century, for a time, the white slave owners, many of whom were professing Christians, defined the common good at the expense of the black African slaves. In another case, where we were living in a Muslim country in the early 90s, during a period of ethnic cleansing, the governing ethnic group, who was in the majority, determined the common good at the expense of a minority ethnic group. So though certain ideals of democracy were upheld, in actual practice, much was lost, and it seems those ideals were forgotten or compromised. People, being the sinners that they are, tend to interpret their religious texts and traditions in the formulating of ideas about democracy with blinders on and according to their own personal preferences and experiences. During the peak of the ethnic cleansing mentioned above, we heard many from the white majority saying, "We've got to kill those blacks." In response, we quoted from the well-known hadith, "La fadla lil-Arabi ala al-Ajami, wa la lil-Ajami ala al-Arabi illa bitaqwa." There is no preference for the Arab over the non-Arab, or the non-Arab over the Arab, except in holiness. Their reply was, "Precisely. See what bad Muslims those blacks are? That's the very reason we have to get rid of them. This was an example of religious legitimation of violence that was certainly never intended by the Prophet. Back in the United States, when I went to have my photo taken for my New Jersey driver's license, I was ordered to remove my headscarf for the license photo. When I explained that it was for religious reasons, the clerk questioned the validity of my religious beliefs on the matter. When my friend went for her passport photo with a headscarf on, the agent questioned her mother repeatedly about the validity of their mother-daughter relationship. What business was it of that clerk to question someone's interpretation of their own religious texts and of the meaning of the phrase for religious reasons? In developing laws in a democracy, one hopes that lawmakers seek to uphold the common good and to respect personal interests as much as possible. However, in practice, those who enforce such laws in people's everyday lives may not share the depth of conviction about the ideals of the common good, balanced with respect for personal interests that the lawmakers tried to take into account in formulating such laws. So we have the ugly realities of police brutality, racial profiling, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, warrantless wiretapping, and the like, which do not belong in a liberal democracy founded on Christian or Muslim principles, whichever the case may be, seeking to balance the ideas of the common good and personal interests. Such things are experienced by the Muslim community in America. Do not give the feeling that we have a liberal democracy here in America, even by the illiberal standards outlined by O'Donovan. To return to the case of the unforeseen consequences of laws set down by men, in Mauritania, a woman cannot obtain contraception without the consent of her husband. This may seem not completely unreasonable to some, since it allows both partners to have input on an important decision that affects them both. However, in our neighbor's case, her husband denied her access to contraception and then proceeded to go out and sleep with a prostitute, and then violently forced himself sexually on his wife and infected her with a sexually transmitted disease, which could have been prevented by the use of a condom. This was surely an unforeseen and unintended consequence of a law intended to uphold Islamic standards, but having an effect which certainly neither the lawmakers nor the Prophet intended. Again, we see the gap between the ideals and the practice. To cite another example, in Mauritania, women caught in adultery are not executed or whipped because Islamic law has a lot of flexibility which allows it to be interpreted mercifully. However, if a woman gets pregnant when her husband is away, she will be brought to trial. While she is in jail awaiting trial, she will almost certainly be raped by the guards. In some cases, when a woman has no one to look after her children, they come into the jail with her. Any daughters who come along are also likely to be raped by the guards. Once again, this was not the intent of the law, but the gap exists between the ideal outworking of laws and actual practice. In listening to the discussions about the Christian tradition yesterday, I felt that the questions being asked were very Western questions, coming from the more individualistic mindset found in Western cultures. I was glad to hear Zaman's Muslim perspective, in which he stated that democracy recommends itself to Qaradawi as a means of preventing or combating despotism, of allowing people to freely express their convictions. The assumption here is that given a real democratic choice, Muslims would overwhelmingly want a system of government guided by Islamic norms, an Islamic state. I'm not sure that all Muslims would agree, but it is important to recognize that there is a large part of the Muslim world who would agree with this assertion. What about democracy and theocracy, not just as they are formulated for a nation, but on a world scale? President Bush has been quoted as saying that after 9/11, he felt that God had raised him up for such a time as this, an allusion to the Hebrew scriptures in the book of Esther, to lead America in the fight against terror. Part of this perception of a responsibility given to him by God has been the sense of calling to spread democracy to other countries. This is an interesting mix of personal faith and the formulation of ideas about democracy. In a desire to spread democracy, who has the right to determine what kinds of democracies are acceptable and what kinds are not. In at least 3 Muslim countries, Palestine, Pakistan, and Iran, fair elections have been held, and there was a peaceful handing over of power from the former administration to the newly elected opposition. But America did not accept the validity of the newly elected administration, even though they were chosen by the people through a democratic process. If it is not legitimate to force our beliefs on others, then are we not obliged to accept others' ideas about democracy, even if they do not conform to ours? As believers, to force our religious beliefs on others seems almost a form of blasphemy, as if to say that God is not capable of revealing his truth in more gentle and peaceable ways to others whom we may believe to have missed God's truth. And so I offer some conclusions from my reflections. Because of our sinful nature, both individually and collectively, there exists a gap between our ideals of theocracy and democracy and our actual practice of that to which we aspire. We as Christians and as Muslims and other people of faith must recognize that gap. We must recognize that gap and seek to correct it. We must also conclude in humility as believers and as fallible human beings that even our best formulations and ideals of theocracy and democracy will never match up perfectly to God's ideas of theocracy and democracy. Theories about the ideals of theocracy and democracy predominantly devised by men and those in the majority often have in practice unforeseen consequences for women and for minorities. We must be careful in comparing our religion and our system of government with other religions and other systems of government, not to compare the best ideals of our own beliefs and systems with the worst practices of the other. The same can be said for comparisons made within our faith of different interpretations of our own scriptures and/or traditions. We must recognize our cultural bias in our formulation of ideas about theocracy and democracy, and in so doing, seek to learn from other cultural perspectives. In the spirit of democracy, we must let other nations determine their own ideals of theocracy and democracy without forcing our concepts of these upon them. If we are concerned about others missing the right way in matters of theocracy and democracy, let us lead and persuade by example, not by coercion. As Zaman described Thanawi's argument, which I will apply to believers of all kinds, believers ought to attend to reforming their religious lives, for it is a heightened commitment to religious norms properly understood, not political activism, that offers the best means of guaranteeing their religious identity. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be with you this morning. The only thing I want to say as to start is a word of caution. I was trained by a Baptist minister from Alabama to speak. You know what that really means. I cannot control my time, and usually I hide my watch in my pocket so that I can talk for as long as I want. And since I know that Yale University is hospitable, I know that the lunch is ready in 3 hours, a big lunch. So sit back and take notes as much as you want.
There is another person after you. Give some time between that and the lunch.
It depends on if we want to apply the rules of democracy or theocracy. If it's theocracy, I am the imam here. Huh? And if it's democracy, we need to go back to Joseph. Huh? Unfortunately, I did not receive Dr. Zaman's paper in time to really go over it. I heard him this morning, like many of you have, and I tried last night and this morning write up some of my ideas that I want to discuss with you. Number one, discussing terms. We very often throw out these terms, democracy vis-a-vis theocracy. we threw out these terms, religious vis-a-vis secular. We assume that all cultures and traditions agree on the definition of these terms. We assume that Arabs and Muslims define these terms the way we define them in America, the way Europe defines them. And I dare to say that is not the case. Not even within the West do people agree on the definition of these terms. There's a huge difference between the word secular in Europe and the word secular in America. Number two, we assume that one is exclusive when the other is inclusive. We also assume that one has a negative connotation to it and the other has a positive connotation to it. We assume that theocracy is made by God when democracy is made by man. Theocracy may suggest an oppressive regime when democracy may suggest a free governance by the people for the people. And I think very often we overlook these terms, and we need to define those terms within the context in which they are used. And unless we define these terms very well and successfully enough, we will fail in the results we come up with. I argue that Islam argues for both terms, theocracy and democracy. I also argue that Islam speaks for a religious state, but also a secular state. Again, in Islamic terms, not necessarily in the way we may see them in America. Islam affirms that in al-hukmu illa lillah, that final judgment and rule belongs to God and to God alone. What does this really mean? Does it mean that God tells us what and how we run our daily affairs, or something else by this very verse? I argue that that verse refers to the word sharia, which is different from the word fiqh. Sharia speaks of guidelines that are divinely made, while fiqh speaks of the daily rules and rules that should govern the lives of people. Sharia is divinely made when fiqh and jurisprudence is manly made. Hence, there is a relationship between these two terms. And Sharia depends on what is called maqasid al-Sharia in Islam, the objectives of law that are divinely made. Those objectives of law are, number one, to safeguard and protect the right to religious freedom by each and every individual within the state. Number two, to safeguard and protect the right to intellect and freedom of speech by each and every human being. Number three, to safeguard the dignity of each and every human being within the state. Number four, to safeguard the right to wealth and accumulating wealth by each and every human being within the state. And the last one, to safeguard the land from corruption. Islam argues that those five principles are maqasid al-Sharia, the objectives of law divinely made. God wants us to safeguard these five objectives. However, how do you translate that into practice depends on the person, on the circumstances, and on the environment. Hence, if the state is run by Sharia law, by those five principles, one may argue for a theocracy. But if one speaks about fiqh, then one is really speaking about secularism. By that, human beings on their own, each in his and her capacity, each in his and her own environment, translate those five objectives of law into daily practices, into daily rules that may change from time to time and place to place. Translating Sharia into regulations was encouraged by Islam, by the teachings of the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad, by the following means. Number one, Islam encouraged attempts of activism in the general public. Number two, Islam encouraged attempts by Muslims to interpret the divine law differently, which means, what does God really mean by safeguarding the land? What does God really mean by safeguarding the intellect and the religious freedom of people. People interpret that law on their own, and people are given the choice to do that. And this is why in Islamic history, Islam has developed a multitude of Islamic schools of thought, from the Hanafi to the Shafi'i to the Hanbali to the Maliki to the Shia school of thought. And within the Shia sect, if you will, there are many schools of thought, from the Ja'fari to the Ithna Ashriya and so on and so forth, because people tried within all of these schools of thought to translate those objectives of law into daily practices that govern their lives. Then the third, the role of the people in deciding for their own affairs. The role of the people in deciding for their own affairs. When Qardawi speaks about the qat'iyat, he means those 5 objectives of law. But he actually goes beyond that in his book, Al-Islam Bayna Ahl al-Fiqh wa Ahl al-Hadith, into talking about how really we have to go beyond the text into reality and interpret the text differently. What matters is the qat'iyat, and by the qat'iyat, he means those 5 objectives of law. Muhammad al-Ghazali argues that on the basis of the intellect and the safeguarding of the intellect and the dignity, women actually can become the heads of states. Justice Aftab Hussain, the justice of the Sharia court of Pakistan, argues that women can become heads of states. And therefore, even if there's an argument between Muslim scholars as to whether women can or cannot, people are falling back on the fiqh, the jurisprudence that may have applied at one time and was accepted, but may not be accepted as we speak. What matters is the qat'iyat themselves. Even Turabi, in his book Women in Muslim Society, argues that women can actually become heads of states. Now I want to move on to the word democracy and how Islam defines democracy. I have the following 8 principles as to how Islam argues for democracy, or what is the Islamic definition of democracy. Number 1, Islam speaks about how the government has to be by the people, for the people. In the Quran, it says, in the Hadith, it says, "Antum a'lamu bi shu'uni dunyakum." O you people, you know about the affairs of your daily life more than me. Meaning, God is not here to tell you what and how you can run your daily affairs. You decide on those daily affairs. And therefore, it's the rule by the people, for the people. Number 2, adopting ways not authentic to traditional Muslim community. This issue was brought up yesterday. Can Islam adopt issues that are not authentic to traditional Islam? And I dare to say yes, because the Prophet Muhammad said, "Al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min." Hikmah, guidance, is the lost wisdom. Is the lost guidance of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he grabs it and runs with it. That is to say, as I understand the tradition of Muhammad, that Muslims are required by the teachings of Islam to adopt things that may not have been traditional at one point, not in practice at one point, and run with them and make them become Islamic if they were to bring about benefit to humanity and not only to Muslims. Number 3, Islam argues for the freedom of religious expression. There's an ayah in the Quran, a verse that says, "La ikraha fi din," there is no compulsion in religion. But also within the history of Islam, Islam spoke about how the ahkam al-Islam la tufradu ala ghayr al-Muslimin. The rules of Islam must not be enforced on other than Muslims. Meaning, if Islam does not allow the eating of pork or the selling of alcohol for Muslims by Muslims, Islam cannot enforce that rule on non-Muslims, because this is an Islamic practice, not a Christian practice, not a Jewish practice, and hence it cannot be enforced on those who don't believe in it. Number 4, Islam gave room for political pluralism. Within the state, Islam allows for people to have different political parties arguing against each other. You find that under the rule, اختلاف أمتي رحمة. Disputes within my ummah, within my community, is a form of mercy. And in the Quran it says, وَلَوْ أَرَادَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعَلَهُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا. If God had willed, He would have made them of one nation, of one thinking, of one paradigm. For me, this argues that it's God's will to make us think differently. I also would refer to the ayah or to the verse in chapter 49, verse 13. O humankind, I, God, created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may come to know each other, not that you may despise each other. The best amongst you is he who is righteous and a doer of good. And therefore, what matters is that these parties argue against each other to bring about the best for the common good of human beings. Also, Islam within that concept spoke about the concept of ijtihad, the concept of trying one's best to interpret the law in a way that brings about a goodness to the society. And with ijtihad, you have different interpretations of the law around the table. Number 5, establishment of a consultative representative government can also be taken from the verse in the Quran, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ. And their affairs of governance must be done by consultative means. Consultative means within that Shura Council, if you will. 6, citizenship is about give and take. Citizenship is about give and take between the government and the people, between the people and the government, and between the people themselves. You find that in hadith material. Number 7, every citizen must contribute to the common good of the society. You find that in a very important rule in Islamic political thought, the concept of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding evil. Enjoining the good and forbidding evil within the society is the role of each and every human being within that society, and therefore each person has to become a part of that activism. I always say refusing to participate in an election is participating in the election. Refusing to make your vote known is making your vote known. And therefore, don't run away, be there and make a difference. Number 8, and the last one here, is daily rules are to change based on new circumstances. And you find that in the very well-known ruling in Islamic jurisprudence called تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان والأمكان, the change of rules with the change of time and circumstances. And therefore, it is the people who change these rules. To conclude, I would like to give the following general guidelines for what I call the Islamic vision of a government. Number 1, Islam encourages people to be politically active without compromising their convictions. Number 2, Islam encourages the creation of a constitutional guideline. However, those constitutional guidelines must not paralyze people from the possibility of development and change for the future. Number 3, every person's vote counts. Number 4, state must encourage its citizens to be, number 1, spiritually active. Number 2, morally excellent. Number 3, umbranically or physically sound. Islam argues that every religion has its own spiritual distinct identity that has to be encouraged within that state. Every religion has its own moral stance. But when it comes to Umran, to the physical soundness of the lives of people, we all work together cooperatively. So even within the state of Islam, if you will, a state that is shaped by Sharia law, by the 5 objectives of law, each religion is empowered to be spiritually empowered in its own way and morally strong in its own way. However, when it comes to how we can operate the daily affairs of our lives, that is the collective work of all religions and of all individuals, whether those of religion and of no religion. Number 5, there are 3 pillars that really govern the rules of Islam beside those 5 objectives of law. Number 1, politics of justice and justice for all. Number 2, economics of equity and equity for all, including women and minorities. And number 3, covenant of community. The state is made of a people, of a community that is made of different memberships, if you will. Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, believers, men and women. We have a covenant with God to protect all the citizens of the state under the rules of politics of justice and economics of equity. My last 2 points, very briefly, in half a minute, before I really become like that Baptist minister. Islamic democracy is not different from how many of us may see democracy. If democracy is about government by the people, for the people, then those divine guidelines allow people and encourage people to be active in the best way possible to bring about the best good for their own citizens. And the last point is, if we really, I believe, take all of these principles and put them together, whether the politics of justice, economics of equity, and a covenant of community, Jews, Christians, and Muslims can work together to bring about a state that is divinely inspired but manly shaped on daily affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very refreshing to hear our panelists, particularly Imam Hendi, to articulate on potentials for an emerging polity that would encourage and embrace values of democracy, as he tried to point at the possibilities and potentials. But I would like to bring, for the sake of argument, a hopefully healthy degree of skepticism in the way that whether historically we can indeed point at any articulation of such notions as democracy and theocracy within the Islamic context, within the experience of Islamic or Muslim societies. Historians obviously would like always to go back and look and see what is there that they can lay their hands on and say, here we are, and this is the evidence that indeed we have these things has been thought about. And as many of you in this room may know, Muslim tradition for close to a millennium or more has produced a whole body of literature on the idea of government. Mostly in the genre that it's known in the West, it's equivalent as the genre of the mirrors, or the mirrors for the princess, or the counsel to the king, or the counsel to the government, which, for better and for worse, was the most prominent body of literature when it comes to political thought. For most of the time, if I would like to generalize, and of course this is a very broad generalization, the jurists, the fuqaha, that is, stayed away from the debate of the forms of government up to, perhaps one might say, 19th century or even later, the 20th century. With few exceptions, of course. I mean, you can always look out and find a passage in Al-Ghazali or a chapter in the work of a Shiite jurist or some other evidence to try to show that the idea of government and governance was indeed the preoccupation of the jurist. But for the thrust of the emphasis on the form of the government and the methods of government was never laid at the shoulder of the jurist. That, I believe, can be attributed to the fact that from very early on, basically from the 7th, 8th century onwards, with the collapse or the breakdown of the notion of the caliphate, which came out very early in the Islamic world, although the institution continued, but the idea very early seemed to be impractical, or rather was defeated by other forces in the Islamic world. Beyond that period, there was a certain recognition of the fact that there are the two spheres, contrary to what we nowadays hear a great deal, that Islam has so essentialist and comprehensive kind of presence in all aspects of life. It can be argued that historically speaking, in classical Islamic period, the two spheres were recognized. And there was a sphere of the government or kingship in much of the literature that I refer to. And there is a sphere of religion, basically. A very famous saying in much of this literature, the imagery that it's used is that religion and government, or rather good government and good religion, are twin sisters, and a kind of Siamese twin sister, that one cannot survive without the other. That is, that the government is always in need of the legitimacy and presumably guidance from the religious authorities, and the religious authorities are in need of the government in order to maintain their presence and conduct their affairs free from bad religion, which is usually the forces of nonconformity and heterodoxy in the society that has been labeled as such. This pattern, although it may seem very conservative, and indeed it was conservative, and it goes back to pre-Islamic times. This is basically a rubric that first emerged, if I'm not wrong, 6th century Sasanian texts, and then was adopted in all of the literature of the Islamic period, was in practice all the way, one might say, up to the end of the 19th century. Still, the way that conceptually these two spheres interacted was in support of each other, and there is much evidence that can one present in support of the presence, the prominence of this idea. This does not necessarily mean that Islam was out of the sphere of government, or Sharia rather was out of the sphere of government, but it has its own place within the system, rather than the idea that Islam is the predominant force in defining the political order. I can also point at another significant theory I'm sure many people in this room are very familiar with, this kind of functional circular notion of justice that again you would find in much of this literature in classical times, and also perhaps in variety of some reflections of that in the literature of modern Islam, that a good government usually survives not because it has been mandated by any divine authority or by the preservation of the Sharia, but it survives because it administers good justice. The theory has perhaps Persian origin, perhaps Greek origin, whatever it is, it has been in the air for a very long time. If you have a good government, that you would have a greater prosperity of the subjects, and the greater prosperity creates greater wealth, and greater wealth creates more powerful, more stable government. In this kind of a circle of justice, or circle of equity as it has usually been referred to, the principle is that the ruler should be guided by the teachings of religion and by the administration of justice through the jurist community in their judicial position to be able to maintain this balance of the circle. In that, the real position that has been usually assigned to the religious establishment, to the judicial establishment, is one of administration of the justice. And I think the jurists were very clear on that point. Much of Islamic law basically deals with aspects of, I need not here to lecture my very learned audience, about aspects of law that does not necessarily interfere with affairs of the government. Affairs of the government is usually, as we know, is considered as people's affairs or public affairs, umur al-amma, that was supposed to be taken care of by the people in the position of authority, namely the government. This duality and distinction between the two, in my opinion, would have been a very fair and suitable ground for the emergence of a more articulate form of indigenous democratic form of state, rather than the one that was adopted or tried to be adopted from the outside, usually in the course of the 19th century. What happens in more modern times, however, we see that by 19th century, much of the energy and intellectual stamina of the Muslim thinkers in the Muslim world, whether in the Shia world or in the Sunni world, is really devoted to how Islam as an entity is to be preserved vis-a-vis the forces of European domination, colonialism, or the overall state of decline of the society, which sometimes was associated with the outside forces, sometimes more likely associated with the corruption, or what they would have called the corruption and the decadence of the Muslim societies from within. This kind of a defiant position, if you like, within the course of the... Am I beyond my time?
No, you're
okay, I'm just going to conclude. So much of energy that was spent by much of the Muslim reformers and thinkers, did not allow a free environment of articulation on vernacular, indigenous notions of government that would be able to observe and differentiate the two spheres of the state vis-a-vis religion, as it was in classical periods observed. In a sense, there is a degree of confusion, one might say, in the writings of much of the modernists in the 19th century and the 20th century. One great example of that I am more familiar with is in the writings of Shi'i jurists of the 20th century, most remarkably of Ayatollah Khomeini and his theory of the mandate of the jurist. The idea of the mandate of the jurist, which is the basic thesis for the creation of an Islamic government, basically is an aberration from the general practice of the jurists up to the time of Ayatollah Khomeini in the 1970s, when he first came up with the idea that the jurists would consider themselves entirely outside of the domain of the state. Because the domain of the state is unjust, the only ideal form of just government is the one that is going to appear under the messianic 12th Imam, or the Imam of the age. And since there is no Imam of the age, the jurists are not interfering or staying away from the affairs of the government, because no matter what, power is corrupting and power is unjust, whatever form of government is going to be presented. That theory is completely reversed by the concept of the mandate of the jurist, whereby the jurist, for the first time, without the articulation of several centuries behind, now switches completely from a position that there has been no interference with the affairs of the government to one that it's now in charge of the government. And indeed, the Sharia, overnight, one might say, finds a new application in creating a new political order, which, of course, the Western world and then eventually the people in the Islamic Republic adopted as being the theocracy, in a sense. As I'm sure many recognize in this room, both concepts of democracy and theocracy are imported notions. Neither of them has an indigenous history in the Islamic context. Hukumat ilahiyya, if you would like, or zimmiratiyya, whatever, democracy, are in a sense translations of these notions, and even the Greek tradition that Islam has adopted since the classical times does not necessarily concerns itself in the Islamic context with these notions, with the notions of democracy and theocracy. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is by the 20th century, these are mostly, in certain degree, importation to try to create a more of an essentialist notion of Islam that has this comprehensive, comprehensive mandate for organizing and regulating all aspects of life, including political. It is very refreshing to hear very lately, after the invasion of Iraq, in the very early months, there was a statement by Ayatollah Sistani, who rather, in contrast to what has been for close to a quarter of a century advocated by the authorities in the Islamic Republic, argued that the forms of government such as democracy are indeed forms of government that stays outside the domain of Islam, and there is not necessarily a task of the jurist to endorse one or the other or reject one or the other. So in a sense, we see a return, or at least I would like optimistically to see a return, whereby the two spheres of state versus religion again being at least recognized, and hopefully this would be a new start in more articulation, a greater articulation of how the differentiation between the two may eventually emerge.
Let's We're going to move now to a time of questions and answers from the floor, and we'll do again what we did last night. Professor Zaman, if you'll come up here and here, so you can take this chair here. And Professor Amanat, if you don't mind sharing your microphone with him. People can feel free to address your questions either to Professor Zaman or to any of the four panelists. And we have in the middle of the hall a microphone there. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, we'd ask that you come and speak into the microphone so that everyone can hear you clearly. And whoever comes up to that microphone first is going to get to ask the first question. And then if there are multiple people, you can simply get in a line leading up to that microphone. I see some people heading for the microphone already. Just feel free to form a line behind Professor Alush. Please.
I have a question primarily addressed to Imam Hendi. I have to admit, listening to you, even myself having grown up in a Muslim environment and having been reading for the last 35 years medieval texts, it made me believe 15 minutes of Islamic utopia, more or less. You mentioned a couple of things. The most important principle that you can with is تغير الأحكام بتغير الزمان. And he talked about it as a given principle here. Now,
can you translate it?
Huh?
Can you translate the
Oh,
principle for those?
yeah, in other words, that if you have, what should I say, what's the best translation? Legal
Changing legal rulings.
legal
will change
rulings,
with time.
legal judgments, or whatever will change with time, basically. Now, this is a most secular concept in itself here when it comes to the concept of law and everything else. Let's take a current example. In the news now, the example of the poor Afghani guy who converted from Islam to Christianity, and there it is. The punishment is non-Islamic law, would be death. And this is based on a Quranic passage. It's not even a hadith or whatever. مَنْ ارْتَدَّ مِنْكُمْ فَاقْتُلُوهُ. This is a given thing.
That's a hadith.
This is hadith?
It's hadith.
All right, so I go back to the munafiqun, whatever. Okay, correct me. But anyway, it's a known thing that, okay. This is one example here. The other example, as far as the premise you're giving us here, is, let's go back now for 100% Quranic for sure, and that's the thing that every Arab Muslim government is struggling with to this day, the issue of equality among the gender, sexes, matters of inheritance. Now you have here in issues of inheritance a Quranic text saying that a man shall inherit twice the share of a woman, or vice versa, any way you want to read it. Now here, no Muslim government, including the best example would be Tunisia here with the whole change of the personal status law way back 1956 or whatever. The one thing that did not happen is changing the laws of inheritance. And the reason for that, it's a pretty tricky question here because you are going straight forward against a Quranic text, right? Not just a hadith or whatever. So here to come and tell me that, see, you talk about as if it's a given or whatever. I would love to hear it. I'd love to see it, but I haven't seen it anywhere else. I mean, and my point is one has to be a little careful to minimize the real issues facing us here as to the role of the Quranic text, the role of the hadith, which at least in my view, the hadith is even a worse obstacle to change than the Quranic text in itself or whatever because of the issues related to it. Can you respond to it? I won't take everybody's time. So.
Yes, I can, and if you give me, believe me, 2 hours, I would. Honestly, I mean...
Take 1 hour, I'll start the Baptist preacher. Amen, brother, hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Honestly, I mean, you opened up very wonderful and important questions that, and I agree with you, that these are issues on the table and are being discussed in the Muslim and in the Arab world. تغير الأحكام بتغير الأزمان والأمكان, the change of rules and regulations with the change of time and circumstances. This is a very well known and widely accepted Sunni and Shi'i ruling within both usul al-fiqh of Shia and Sufism and Sunni. And I have attended many conferences held by both communities, and this is always cited by both communities. So this is not something that I'm coming up with and we never heard of. On the contrary, you have, if you were to go to Al-Azhar University or Islamic University in Islamabad, Pakistan, I have done that myself. There are hundreds, literally, of PhD dissertations in which scholars discuss this very notion of the change of rules and regulations with the change of time and circumstances.
Does that include changing the Quranic text or saying, okay, that's now anachronistic, let's forget about it, let's move on from there?
Sure. Now, this is why you discuss 2 different things. Number 1, let me start with the issue of inheritance. للذكر مثل حظ الأنثيين. That's what the verse says, that the male will get 2 shares of a female. I agree with you that the verse is in the Quran, but I disagree with you in terms of history, but also in terms of writings of Muslim scholars. What do I mean by that? I have come across documents 78 documents from the Bayt al-Maqdis court between 1150 and 1350, in which women were given much more than males were given in terms of inheritance. I have come across documents from Al-Mosul court and from the Cairo court, historically, in which women were given more than the shares of males. And we know of a hadith also from the history of the Prophet Muhammad of a woman who came to him with the name of Zainab. When her father died, she claimed that she was actually in charge of the children, meaning her siblings, and not her brothers. And therefore she argued that the Quran gave men more than it gave women only because men had more responsibility. And therefore it is not dividing inheritance by gender, but based on responsibility. And Muhammad actually ordered for that woman to be given more than the shares of her brothers. This is why if you read the fiqh of Abu Hanifa, the very well-known jurist, I have come across, and Dr. Amila Sunbul, a sociologist at Georgetown University, published a book on this issue from her research in Sharia courts, that Islamic inheritance gives people shares based on their responsibility and not gender-based. And Abu Hanifa says exactly that. That's exactly what Khalid Abul Fadl argues. That's exactly what Justice Aftab Hussain argues. It's an 800 pages book written by Justice Aftab Hussain, in which there's a chapter that's 113 pages on the rules of inheritance, and he cites many, I don't remember now, but he cites many cases in which women were given more than men. The issue of the...
You did not answer my question. Do these mean that the Quranic text was not followed historically or whatever?
No. What I'm telling you is that jurists interpreted the verse not to be a literal verse, but rather a circumstantial verse. That the verse ordered for those males to be given more than women because within the context of that verse, men had more financial responsibilities. But when the circumstances,
Let me say something. The verse itself goes into more details, saying the parents will get this share, the brothers and sisters will get this share. It's quite specific there. It's not just a general principle to say, okay, maybe it was adopted sometime because other attenuating circumstances, it was not that much, whatever. This is my point.
Let me give you, Imam Hendi, just a brief last word on that, and then I want to give some other people a chance to ask a question.
Again, if you go back to the Quran that you are talking about, we know that the Quran talks about how at the end of a war, soldiers are to be given 1/5 of the land that was conquered. At the time of Umar stopped practicing that law, and when he was asked as if he was changing the Quran, he said, no, I understand the Quran in a different context, meaning I don't take the Quran literally, I take the circumstances in which the verse was revealed. And that's exactly what I am saying in terms of the verses of inheritance. That yes, there are very detailed verses, 3 verses, that talks about inheritance. However, we have to understand them within the context of revelation and must not paralyze us from the possibilities of change, development, and reform.
Next question.
Hi, yes, I would be very curious to hear you all reflect on the difficulty of religious freedom and religious pluralism in Islamic countries, particularly as the United States takes a more forward role in promoting religious freedom in the Middle East. You can look at our involvement in the assistance with the Afghani constitution, with the Iraqi constitution. There's a lot of emphasis placed on how to protect religious minorities and promote religious freedom. But even though they move forward in creating fairly progressive human rights protections in the Iraqi constitution, for example, they included the repugnancy clause, which in the end says, if there are any contradictions with Islamic law, we always side with Islamic law. And the question of religious freedom, I think, really gets to the heart of not only are we dealing with what's the difference between a Christian-based versus Islamic-based constitution, but particularly on the human rights front, is religious freedom a special human right with respect to how to protect that in an Islamic country?
open to anybody.
Okay. Well, needless to say, this is both an excellent question and also one that is extremely difficult to address and answer. And I think that also following up on the previous exchange, I think that one of the crucial problems that Muslim intellectuals and ordinary Muslims also face and have faced for not a short time is the question of religious authority. It's not enough simply to say that something is stated in the foundational texts, in the Quran, or in something attributed to Muhammad. Because that doesn't really begin even to address the question of exactly what it is that even the supposedly unambiguous statement really is meant to mean. And as I think was pointed out by the panelists as well, there is in fact a very considerable disjunction, not only between the religious sphere and the secular sphere, as Professor Amanat is very rightly pointing to, but also a very considerable disjunction between things as God may have intended them, things lodged, so to speak, in the mind of God, and the way in which humans understood or might understand them. And the idea that ultimately the latter, the human understanding of these things, can only be an approximation, and therefore always fallible, and always contingent on particular circumstances, and always subject to improvement. Which is why people who take that sort of disjunction seriously would argue that there's no way that you can simply open the book and say, well, see, chapter 4, verse such and so says this, and it cannot mean anything but this. This is why many people would argue that what many traditional pre-modern jurists have wanted to do is therefore to engage with the whole history of engaging with the foundational texts. That this is the path through which you can even, that is the closest that you can get even to approximating what God might have intended. That God stopped speaking, so to speak, with the death of Muhammad in 682. And that there's nothing better than simply engage with that. Now, this sort of long-winded preface to the answer is really to say that there's no simple or straightforward way of answering the question of what Islam has to say on this or that, on democracy or secularism, on pluralism, or on any number of things. It seems to me that the best sort of way, or one sort of way to approach it, is to look at things in from a variety of different angles, which would be to look at the time and place one lives in. Also look at the whole history of debates on related matters, which is not to say that one necessarily would expect to find a discussion under the title pluralism or secularism or democracy. It is to say, however, that there could be all sorts of matters that could pertain on that. And one would find, I think it's safe to say, that there is indeed a spectrum of positions on these matters, rather than one single, intolerant, absolutist view. And that it would be impoverishing to simply throw the entire discursive tradition out the window and start afresh. Because there is, in fact, a possibility, just as there are extremely troubling, absolutist, misogynistic, illiberal, militant things in that tradition, there are matters of a different sort as well. And simply to assume that it never existed, or that all of it is reactionary, doesn't necessarily advance the argument. So this is in a way, it's not a particularly helpful answer, I realize, because it doesn't say yes or no. There is pluralism, there isn't, or what to do about it. It just is to say that this is a matter of complex discussion, and it's not today or since last year or the last century even that the discussion has been happening, but for a long time. And also, one more thing quickly, that the way in which this tradition or resources from it or things from the foundational texts themselves and so forth are put to use itself reflects not any particular imperative in that tradition itself, but relations of power in a particular context as well. The way in which people would latch on to one thing, the most oppressive or the most absolutist or the most inegalitarian, rather than another, also reflects the ways in which they themselves are often jockeying for power in their local context against local rivals as well. And that, too, I think, ought to be taken into account in these discussions.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, answering this question about the difficulty of freedom of religion in Muslim context, that with the recent restrictions on civil liberties in the United States, I think we're like shooting ourselves in the foot kind of thing. Like we've been for many years promoting human rights in the world, and every country has a human rights report that the government prepares. And for a certain period of time, I think it was really the case that there were Muslim countries aspiring to democracy who were looking to the United States as an example of a champion of human rights. And I think that it was actually bothering their conscience when they didn't uphold human rights. But now that things are kind of turning and we're seeing violations of human rights at Abu Ghraib, at Guantanamo Bay, and some of the other things that I mentioned, the warrantless wiretapping, these kinds of things, some of the Muslim countries, I think they're looking, and I've seen this in the media, in the Muslim media, they're saying, hey, you guys were the ones that were going to uphold these important principles of human rights, and now look what you're doing. Well, we're not going to, why should we be doing it if you're not doing it? And you were the ones that went on for so many years being the champion of human rights and preparing these reports on us and reporting on things that we have or haven't done. So again, I think it's important that we examine ourselves and say, how can we lead and persuade by example? Because a lot of talk about, these things, one can spend time on that, but at the end of the day, I think our example speaks louder than our words.
I want to say a word about that. Very often from my experience, especially with the media in the last few years, and by the way, I'm going to be at 12 o'clock on ABC News addressing the issue of the Afghani convert to Christianity. They just called me before we started the panel.
I told them to call you.
Really? Thank you. You put me in trouble. Every time people talk about Sharia being enforced in Afghanistan or Iraq, the red flags go up and people become so frightened. No, we don't want Sharia law to be enforced. My argument that I was trying to make is that to all sides, before you reject Sharia law for good, no matter what, study what Sharia law really says. And if there's anything within Sharia law that can be seen as a positive force for the Iraqis and for the Afghans. And number 3, do not assume that Sharia law degrade men and Christians and minorities and women. Number 4, allow room for debate and dialogue within Muslim countries on those issues. When I was in Pakistan a few months ago, speaking at Fatima Ali Jinnah University on women's issues, I urged the Pakistani women to be in the forefront, arguing for their own interpretation of Sharia law in regard with women. And I said, do not accept male-dominant interpretations of how women should be interacted with and what they can or cannot do. Be in the forefront and dialogue. And why am I saying this? Because if we allow that free spirit of engagement and discussion, we will come up surprised of what can happen positively for minorities, but also for women. And the last point is, I am not arguing for the Taliban form of Sharia law. I'm arguing for an open platform for dialogue and free interpretation of the law within certain paradigms.
I think Frank,
Go ahead.
Frank is You're a specialist on the laws of apostasy.
Well, but
what does it say? I mean, be very clear.
Professor Griffel has published a book titled Apostasy and Tolerance in Islam, so maybe he knows something.
Right, so that again would be a subject that we can talk about for many hours, but let me just maybe connect it to that. The one thing that I actually brought up in my comments were, in fact, what the Qaradawi says are the qat'iyat al-shara, and I'm not so sure whether he means by that the maqasid, because what he seems to have in mind are things, and Adel in his question alluded to that are considered just what we call nas, that are just there in the text. And in a matter of speaking, the problem that we're dealing with in all religious tradition is that there are just things that come down to us, in this case, that we, in a matter of speaking, have to negotiate. And that's what many members of the panel refer to, that all these things have to be negotiated. And even when we talk about the changing of rules at the changing times, well, we say we can negotiate them in a contemporary context. But Adel's question, I think, alluded to the fact that very often we see limitations to these kinds of negotiations. And in a matter of speaking, and sometimes that hits us quite violently. And I think actually we're if we can talk about, if we can see that way in Afghanistan, it seems to be the case right now. Now, Adel actually referred to the fact that there is a very clear hadith of the Prophet in this case, which basically says whoever changes his religion needs to kill him. It's an imperative in this case. But it needs also to be said that in the past, and that's an interesting thing in Islamic law, in the past, Muslim jurists have always tried to avoid to implement this kind of judgment. There were several legal institutions in this case which have basically tried to avoid all this, meaning that by and large in classical Islamic Sharia the position was more or less that as long as you somehow acknowledge some kind of, even as a lip service, some kind of in this case being part of Islam, and even whatever you practice, then this kind of law of apostasy is not going to apply. It's interesting that when you look into the 20th century, Sharia is differently understood. Sharia is often understood as a code of law. One would look at a hadith as something like we would look at a paragraph in, like, for instance, the Code Napoleon or something like that, in the European style of law. And there, this kind of understanding, which is, in a matter of speaking, much more simplistic than we have seen it in classical Sharia as it was practiced in the past, often looks into this verse, or in this case, in this particular hadith, and says, well, it's just there. And what do we do? And there again, but nevertheless, that does not prevent from what Professor Qasim Zaman actually said, that at the end of the day, these are things that Afghans have to negotiate with themselves. The way I see it right now, it's not that there are no Afghans who wouldn't object to this kind of application of what Sharia is. So again, we should in this case, and here I subscribe to what Imam Yahya Hendi says, we should in this case leave some kind of space in this case for negotiation what in this case Sharia is. Now obviously still that brings us to the question, should we accept something like this as outsiders or not? And that's obviously something very difficult for us to discuss. Let's not forget that although I don't want to carry this too far, but there are many things that happen in the penal system in America that many people outside of America would say are not desirable at all. So again, it's a difficult decision in this case, and just the question that you bring up, what's in this case the law? I would say it's a certain kind of application of this hadith that we're seeing now in Afghanistan, which nevertheless, in this case again, is to a certain extent maybe regarded as a qat'iyat or not. I think actually these are negotiable issues.
Thank you. I know there are a number of other people who have questions, so I'm going to ask you to keep your questions short, and we'll keep the answers short so we can hopefully get a few more in before we run out of time. Professor Qunsiya.
Yeah, thanks for excellent panel. I was just wondering, when we look at, and you talked a little bit about the U.S. having promoted human rights, and I would take issue with this as a theme of U.S. I mean, the U.S. has used human rights and religious freedom and democracy as clubs, basically, against regimes that they don't like. and opposed them when they are, obviously with regimes that they liked, and especially in the Middle East, this historically has been the case. So my question in regards to the issue of religious freedom and promotion of religious freedom and universal norms, and I think Edward Said alluded to that in his book Orientalism, where he argued that basically sometimes liberal Democrats can be imperialists in sheep's clothing, basically. They can argue for freedom and so forth, and they use it essentially as a club to hit other countries with and say, we, the white man's burden, know what's better for them, those brown-skinned, inferior people who don't really know what they are doing. And so I'm not sure exactly how to frame this question, but would you say that in our dealings with third world countries, so-called third world countries and so forth, we should perhaps just let go of this concept that we know a little bit about human rights and religious freedom more than they do, and just let them do what international law says, which is self-determination?
And thus kill their own citizens?
Well, no. I mean, look at Israel, for example. Israel doesn't uphold religious freedom, and we say,
I did everything on that side, but does it in this case, does it involve for us to accept the fact that they would kill their own citizens?
Well, no, of course not. Doesn't mean that we have the right to go in there and fix it for them, so to speak. Just like we would not expect other people to come and fix our problems, which you alluded to. I wouldn't expect the United Nations to send troops here so that they uphold our rights to have conversations internationally without being tapped,
Anybody want to comment on that before?
I agree with some of your premise that America should not act the world police, go into countries and change regimes as it wishes. But I may disagree in terms of I call on Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and on humanists to have a dialogue.
What about the non-believers?
And non-believers, without any doubt. Maybe that's what I meant by humanists. All people to come around the table to dialogue as to what we mean by human rights and how to protect them together.
But what is this dialogue? We hear a lot about dialogue. Dialogue about what? Dialogue to try to accept each other's shortcomings and try to patch it up in a sense that it would be acceptable to all, or is it trying to arrogate a sense of certain human values that should be acceptable by all? Because it can be understood either way. It can be understood that dialogue is basically to try to negotiate where I'm going to oppress you and where you are going to oppress me, or whether it means that indeed there are some principles, universal human rights principles that are going to be.
For me, it's our ability to sit together to decide on those universal principles that are accepted by all and must be honored by all parties involved.
Let me see if somebody else wants to ask a question. I know there are a number.
Imam Hendi, you painted a very interesting picture of Islamic ideals of government. My question to you is, in your opinion, does God want us to actually close the gap between Sharia and fiqh, which would fit in with the modern concept of progress? Or is our job simply to attempt this reconciliation? How does this attempt at reconciliation fit in with the Islamic concept of tadahwur az-zaman, which you could define as the steady decline of society as we move away from the prophetic era?
Interesting. By the way, I am one of the panelists. But I'm happy that I was able to provoke you guys enough to ask me questions. And I really think, Dr. Zaman, if you could add to this question. I think the debate is open as to what I am really asking for. An attempt to reconciliate, at one point to close the gap, but at one point to really reconciliate between Sharia and fiqh.
Mr. Zaman, do you want to add something there?
I